All right, welcome to this joint Salem Center and Austin Institute talk. We do a couple of these this semester. I'm Mark Ramirez, I'm professor of sociology here, and also the president of the Austin Institute for the Study of Family and Culture, which is located a little bit northeast, about 15-minute walk from the edge of campus. I'm happy to introduce my friend, Brad Wilcox, who's a professor, university professor of sociology at the University of Virginia. We met 28 years ago. We've been friends ever since. We met at a small kind of collection of political scientists and sociologists who were being taught and learning how to analyze data, especially on American religion. He was already working on sociology of family then. I got into it much, much later, but he's a dear friend. He's here to talk about something dear to our hearts at the Institute called his new book, Get Married, which when I first saw it, I thought it was going to be just about like, oh, the importance of getting married. But now that I've read it, it's a tour de force of what the process leading up to getting married and the marital dynamics, how to stay married. And it's a pretty, it's a unique book within the sociology of marriage and family. And I appreciate it very much. Just a quick pitch for the Austin Institute, which jointly hosts these Salem, austin-institute.org. Gets to the website and tells you a little bit about what we do. So without further ado, my dear friend, Brad Wilcox.
Thank you, Mark, and thanks to Austin and Salem for having me here today. It's great to be in Austin, Texas, particularly because we're getting hit pretty hard by leaning over on the East Coast. So it's nice to have weather like this for my visit to Texas. So I want to begin by just sort of returning to kind of where I'm from, and that is the University of Virginia. And I've been kind of literally literally living in the shadow of Thomas Jefferson for more than 20 years. Our home kind of sits under Monticello, which is the home that's depicted up there on the screen for you, where Thomas Jefferson lived. And Thomas Jefferson, of course, is famous for a lot of different things. But one of the things that he's famous for is being the primary author of the Declaration of Independence. And in that declaration, of course, tags the importance for the American experiment of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Yeah, the pursuit of happiness in the Declaration. So how are we doing when it comes to this core dimension of the American experiment, the pursuit of happiness? I'd like to suggest to you this afternoon that we're not doing very well. We're seeing data both in Gallup, as this slide here indicates, as well as in what's called the General Social Survey, leading social barometer, that happiness in America is coming down. And perhaps that's because we're chasing the wrong things today in today's society, today's culture. And I'm thinking particularly of what I would call kind of like the Midas mindset. And this is the idea that kind of our ruling class in the academy, here defined in the pop culture, in journalism, that we should kind of steer clear from marriage and family and towards kind of mammon, broadly understood, towards money, towards the unencumbered life, and towards especially work. So again, it's this idea that kind of mammon is more important for us than things like marriage and family. So what am I talking about concretely? What are some examples of this kind of Midas mindset being articulated in today's culture? One example comes from Bloomberg, which had an article published not too long ago. Women who stay single and don't have kids are getting richer. So staying single is linked to getting richer in this Bloomberg account. So kind of making the case that financially the path to prosperity runs away from marriage and family and not towards it, being presented here by Bloomberg. And then this Bloomberg article also had a number of examples of women who were single and childless and were kind of living their best life. Women like Ashley Moreira, who's pictured up here on the screen, who has high-end properties in Manhattan and the Jersey Shore, who travels frequently for both pleasure as well as work. And in her own words says, I love my life and feel very fulfilled. So again, kind of suggesting to us that the path to prosperity and happiness, runs away from marriage and family and, not towards it. And this sentiment is by no means limited to Bloomberg. We see articles in Atlantic making the case against marriage. We see an author from Brooklyn, Amy Shern here, who's making the argument that married heterosexual motherhood in America is a game that no one wins. Again, a pretty anti-nuptial and anti-natal perspective from this writer in Bloomberg, in Brooklyn, appearing in the New York Times. Now, if I was to kind of make the argument that there are a lot of left-wing cultural elites who are kind of making arguments against marriage and family, that's not particularly surprising, I think, for us to sort of think about. But what's newer, I think, today is we're also kind of getting the message from some precincts of the right that marriage and family are kind of a bad deal. Although here, the message is coming from, the message being directed towards young men as opposed to women. So I think here, obviously, Pearl Davis and Andrew Tate, who are kind of leading figures online making the case against marriage. Andrew Tate is kind of seen as like the king of the manosphere online. And in his words, there is zero statistical advantage for men when it comes to marriage. Pearl Davis says that marriage is a death sentence for men. And their perspective is that most marriages today end in divorce, and that guys are kind of taken to the cleaners, both financially and when it comes to the custody of their kids in marriage today. So men should steer clear of marriage. They should get kind of, physically strong and fit. They should make a lot of money and use, but not invest in the opposite sex. It's kind of the red pill right's take on marriage. So again, we're getting voices from the left sort of telling women to kind of steer clear of marriage and family, and now from parts of the right directed towards men that are in their own ways advancing this kind of Midas mindset. And I see this mindset also articulated by students at the University of Virginia, students like Holly, for instance, a recent student of mine. She said, U-based students are definitely more focused on their education and getting their career started than getting into a serious relationship, she said. If it happens, great, but the focus is definitely on building our own brands first. Basically, the thought process is relationships and love are a risk, but you always have your career and success to fall back on. Again, so love is a risk, but career is going to be kind of the foundation for her, she thinks. And this perspective is also reflected in a lot of recent polling from outlets like Pew. You can see here, for instance, that 71% of Americans now think that career is kind of the best path when it comes to fulfillment, and only 23% kind of would sort of look at marriage as a path to fulfillment in today's cultural context. So these kinds of shifts in both elite and popular attitudes about marriage and family, I think, help us to understand why the American heart is, in my words, closing to an important extent. We're seeing dating down, we're seeing marriage down. Here, marriage is falling by about 60% from 1970 to the present, okay? And what does that mean kind of practically for young adults, both here coming in the audience and just more generally? What it means is about 1 in 3 adults today will never marry. They'll end up kind of as permanent bachelors and bachelorettes, kind of navigating life without a spouse in their life. And we've kind of never been in a demographic moment where we're projecting so many folks are not going to end up becoming husbands and wives in this society. And that also, of course, relates to the trends in fertility. And this is kind of one more expression of the closing of the American heart. So we're seeing here, for instance, that our fertility rate in the United States has reached a record low, just 1.6 babies per woman over kind of the course of their life. And this is significant in part because the replacement rate where we're kind of sustaining our population absent, immigration, is 2.1. But now we're obviously well below that. And again, we've kind of never been in a place where fertility in the United States is so low. And we're projecting too that this rate's going to keep coming down in the US as well going forward. And that means practically that about 1 in 4 young adults today will never end up as moms and dads. And if this projection is accurate, I think it is, that's also going to be kind of a record demographic trend for the US. Again, one more expression of the closing of the American heart. Now, of course, as you might guess, sitting here at UT Austin, there are certainly voices out there in journalism and the academy who think all of this is just fine. Thinking, for instance, in the academy of someone like the sociologist Eric Klinenberg, the author of Going Solo, had an interview with the New York Times where he couldn't really muster a negative word about the kinds of trends we're talking about when it comes to marriage and family in America. Talking about kind of singleness, he said, quote, "For young professionals, it's a sign of success and a mark of distinction, a way to gain freedom and experience the anonymity that can make city life so exhilarating. For someone who's recently divorced, it's a way to reassert control over your life and maybe become less lonely." So kind of the rise of, again, a lot of Americans going solo, to kind of use his phrase, is associated in his thinking with success, with control, with freedom, kind of maybe keys in his perspective to meaning and a happy life. But forgive me for thinking that in a nation marked by rising economic inequality, at a time when more and more Americans are addicted to what I would call electronic opiates, depicted up here on the screen, one example. In a period where many folks, particularly many younger adults, are beset by loneliness, and in a country where a lot of folks are unmoored by rising normlessness, where there are kind of fewer norms to ground and guide our lives, I think it's in this kind of newer economic and technological and social and normative context that marriage and family actually matter more than ever in today's world. And I'm thinking, for instance, to kind of give you one example, one story, if you will, kind of playing out in American life today, the story of a guy that I'll call Scott, who lives in the outer suburbs of Washington, D.C. Now, by the standards of kind of the mindset, nothing should be wrong with Scott's life. He has a graduate degree. He's got a good job as a military contractor. He makes more than 6 figures. But Scott is not a happy man. He says, I've got degrees on my wall. I've got accomplishments and certificates, but it doesn't mean anything in the end, is what he told me. It's not like I can take any of that with me after I die. Scott feels alone and at sea on many a day. But I have to get up every day and look in the mirror and realize I'm alone. I have nobody. And he worries about the kind of fate that might await him if he should ever fall sick later in life. I have no help, Something happened to me tomorrow, there'd be no one for me. So Scott is struggling with kind of a toxic mix of loneliness, meaninglessness, and sadness. Now, to be sure we know that there are many single adults who are flourishing, and there are many married folks who are floundering. But on average, the rise of a larger and larger share of adults who are single is one of the big factors that's driving this decline in happiness in the United States. You can kind of see this in the next slide. There's a recent study from the University of Chicago economist, Sam Peltzman, who looks at shifts in happiness in the GSS and finds that this recent decline in marriage can explain statistically most of the recent decline in overall happiness. So again, the point here is that millions and millions of American adults are experiencing greater difficulty in realizing that classic Jeffersonian pursuit, the pursuit of happiness, because they're not able to marry or they're not interested in marriage. So that's the bad news about the closing of the American heart that's unfolding in a decent share of our culture today. And you might be asking yourself, well, is there any good news to report about marriage and family in America? And I have kind of two different things to say about kind of, I would say, the good news about marriage and family. And what is there actually is, I think, both in some precincts in academia and then also in journalism, where we're kind of recognizing the value of marriage and family in somewhat kind of new ways, both for kids and for adults. So Melissa Kearney at Brookings and University of Maryland, an economist, has a new book out called The Two-Parent Privilege that articulates ways in which marriage matters for kids today. And then my book, Get Married, has been covered in the New York Times, other venues, kind of making the case that marriage matters for adults, for both men and women in America today. And then just kind of give you a kind of a more detailed sense of some of my findings from the book. One of the things that I find is that nothing matters for happiness in America, like especially a good marriage. And what I mean by that is that, again, a lot of folks today think that, education, money, and work are the key to a fulfilling or a happy life. And yet what I find in the general social survey, the GSS, is that yes, those things are indeed predictive of more happiness for Americans, for both men and for women, as you can see up here on the screen. So having more money, for instance, than average is linked to an 88% increase in your odds of being very happy with your life more generally. But we can see here that just being married is a better predictor of happiness than job satisfaction or money and education. And then being in a very happy marriage is a very powerful predictor of being very happy with your life in general. In fact, when you look at the GSS, there is no variable that's a better predictor of happiness for ordinary men and women than marital quality. And so again, not money, not education, not career satisfaction, not sexual frequency, not self-rated health, all factors that typically are strongly linked to happiness for ordinary adults. So again, it's kind of reminding us or telling us that that marriage matters a lot. And from my perspective, this makes sense because, as Aristotle said, we are social animals. We're hardwired to connect, and our ties with others, with friends and family, end up being pretty important for our well-being. They lend meaning, direction, and a sense of solidarity to our lives. Opportunities both to receive, but also to give care towards others. And it's these kinds of things that matter a lot more for our happiness, than how much money we have in the bank or what kind of debris is on our wall. So again, part of, I think, the good news about marriage and family is that we're discovering more and more ways in the recent economic and sociological research of the ways in which marriage matters for both kids and for adults. But the other kind of big piece of good news that I want to convey to you this afternoon is that we're also seeing in my research that there are 4 groups of Americans who are succeeding at marriage and are markedly happier for it. Okay? So let me stop just here for a second and ask, this audience, if you haven't read the book, that's of course an important caveat, who do you think those 4 groups of Americans who are more likely to be getting married today in the first place and then stably married or happily married in the second place? Yes, sir.
Religious conservatives?
So religion is one group, right? And then conservatives are a second group, of the 4 groups that I've articulated in the book. Yes. What's another group that you think is more likely to succeed today when it comes to marriage in America? Yes, sir.
Asian Americans.
Yes, that's the 3rd group that I call out in the book. And then the 4th group. Yes, sir.
People who come from married families, people who are not divorced.
Yeah, that's actually, that's a good guess, but what I'm actually looking at is just sort of a class story here. And kind of my segmentation for the four groups of Americans who are flourishing. So again, Asian Americans, conservative Americans, the faithful or religious Americans, and then strivers or college-educated Americans. These four groups today are more likely to be both getting married and staying married. Now, I would also kind of acknowledge that when I began this research project, I thought it would be just the Asian Americans, the strivers of college-educated Americans, and the faithful. But as I ran analysis with my colleague, Dr. Wendy Wynn, we found that ideology was an independent predictor of marriage, net of controls for things like race and ethnicity, education, and religion. So it suggests that ideology has kind of emerged as its own important predictor of marriage in contemporary America. So what's their secret? Well, in part, it's that they often, especially those sort of cultural groups we just discussed, are either explicitly or implicitly defying a lot of the ideologies sort of propagated by elites today. What I mean by that is they're more likely to kind of embrace a familialistic lifestyle rather than an individualistic lifestyle. They're more likely to appreciate the power of commitment and love and marriage, and to realize that once you've made a particular choice, you've got to exclude other choices in your marriage and family life. And then also they often have either, again, some kind of explicit or implicit appreciation of the way in which tradition often has value when it comes to sort of navigating marriage and family life in America today. That some new innovations that have come down the relationship pipe should not be embraced today. Now, in the book, I'm more concretely talking about kind of 5 pillars: communion, children, commitment, cash, and community in contemporary marriages. But in the interest of time, I'm just going to focus today on communion, commitment, and community. So when it comes to communion, again, I think our elites are often stressing a kind of a me-first approach to marriage that privileges autonomy and freedom and self-interest. Okay? Things that are kind of in tension with what I would consider to be communion. So one example of this comes from kind of financial advice about kind of how to order your marriage. What you see from a lot of financial professionals today and journalists and gurus like Susie Orman is kind of this idea that you should have a me-first approach to money. You've got kind of his account and her account in your marriage, and then you're not kind of merging your accounts. You're not kind of sort of focusing your financial approach to marriage with joint accounts. And you kind of see the quote up above from Susie Orman talking about having your own nest egg to fall back on, the things, good stuff in your marriage. When I spoke to ordinary couples, though, across the U.S., I had the sense that couples who had more of a we-first approach to money were more likely to be flourishing. I'm thinking of John and Maria Erickson, and when they were first engaged, for instance, they were the 82nd Airborne, in the Army, and they were getting ready to deploy to Iraq. And Maria went out to get some, items for their move to Iraq, and they included an expensive item, ballistic glasses. And so when she brought these items back, to share with John, she made it clear that she expected to be reimbursed at that point in time. But John just kissed her on the forehead and said to her, "What is yours is mine, and mine is yours, and now we're going to be married. It's all going to be equal." And this was kind of like the beginning of an approach to money where they were pooling their income. And this is kind of a new thing for her because we had been raised in a family where her parents had separate accounts. She kind of had to readjust her thinking to kind of this approach. But she notes that, she quickly benefited from this arrangement because she brought a lot of debt from her college and graduate years into the marriage, and John brought no debt. So by quickly pooling their income, they were able to pay off her debt and go on to establish, a secure and strong marriage that's been going for more than 25 years through a lot of, military drama and employments. And they're by no means an outlier. We see in my own research with the YouGov survey is that couples who have joint accounts in the lighter orange here are happier in their marriages than couples who don't have all of their accounts held jointly in the darker orange. And they're less likely to be sort of worried about divorce as well. And for those of you who kind of know something though about selection effects, you might be wondering, well, maybe it's the kind of couples who are, just more committed in general and have kind of better marriages in general, that just sort of gravitate towards joint accounts, and that having joint accounts per se does not causally affect marriage. Right? That'd be a good, I think, social scientific question about this particular figure, for instance. What's cool is we have a new study from Indiana University where psychologists randomly assigned newlyweds, okay, only academics do this, but randomly assigned newlyweds to either A, joint accounts, B, separate accounts, or 3 to do as they pleased. And this Indiana University study found that couples who were randomly assigned to joint accounts did much better in the first 2 years of marriage. So I think this is pretty compelling evidence that, again, taking part of a we-first approach to marriage, in this case financially, fosters a kind of unity and teamwork, mutual service or dependence that's more likely to kind of help couples flourish in this case, from the get-go. Okay, the second kind of, it's actually sort of C word here is commitment that I talk about as a kind of pillar for good marriages in America today. And I think you have to acknowledge that really, even since the 1970s, many of our elites have been kind of discounting the value of one expression of commitment, that is kind of marital permanence. Okay, this idea that marriage is for life. We're kind of getting a lot of messaging around divorce that would kind of discount this more classic understanding of marital commitment. But today, we're also kind of getting a lot of elites kind of questioning the value of sexual fidelity and monogamy, obviously. And what do you think I'm thinking of on this latter point? What's one recent example that comes to mind for anyone here in the audience of the way in which our elites are kind of questioning kind of the value of the sort of classic norm about marriage and fidelity that you've seen?
Polyamory being like something that's talked about a lot.
Yeah, so polyamory has really kind of gotten a lot of attention in recent years. There was a big story in the New York Times, for instance, that came out earlier this year. I just can't make this stuff up. How a polyamorous mom had a big sexual adventure and found herself. Okay, just even the framing of kind of finding herself, really kind of does a good job of articulating the kind of thinking that I'm critiquing here, both in the lecture and then in the book as well. And of course, where do you think she's from?
Brooklyn.
From Brooklyn. Right? Something about Brooklyn, I don't know what it is, but there's something in the water there, something that's like, I don't know. But anyways, when I spoke to ordinary couples, though, again, I got the sense that kind of Molly's approach to polyamory was not kind of conducive to marital success. In fact, something quite the opposite. Something here of a guy that I call Patrick, who is a tall, handsome, well-spoken redhead from Central Virginia, who's in sales and travels a lot for his work. He also meets a lot of people. He plays guitar in a band on the side, which are all things that kind of might boost his risk for infidelity. But Patrick is intentional about protecting his marriage in real life. He says, quote, when I'm meeting new people in my line of work, I talk a lot about my wife and kids. I want them to know I'm a family man, he said. And then also when it comes to sort of his online approach, he says this. He says, my wife is tagged in a majority of my posts. My status is listed as married, and interactions online are treated the same way as if in person. I do not follow old girlfriends as there's a reason that they're in that category, is what he said to me. Just kind of maintaining some boundaries both in the real world and the virtual world that are kind of designed to protect his marriage. It's probably no accident that his wife, Kelly, gave their marriage a 10 on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 of course being the best rating for marriage. And then we see in the GSS again that Americans who are married kind of take the more classic view. that any kind of sex outside of marriage is always wrong are happier in their marriages compared to Americans who have a more contemporary view. But it's not always a wrong thing. So again, I think commitment's pretty important for contemporary marriages, and there's just a lot of research kind of measure commitment in different ways to kind of tell us that one of the best predictors of marital quality is often one form of commitment kind of measured in one way or another across literature. Okay, and the final C we're talking about this afternoon is community. And I think the elite view is often today that one kind of community, religious community, is kind of an obstacle to living your best life or realizing your best love. Again, an obstacle to living your best life and realizing your best love. What am I talking about? Well, one example that comes to mind here fairly recently is a big interview with a sociologist named Sam Perry in the New Yorker, and Professor Perry was kind of making the argument in this New Yorker interview that evangelical Christian men were guilt-ridden, and that evangelical couples had a lot of conflict over pornography. That suggested that their kind of more archaic understanding of sexuality was causing difficulty, both for Christian men in particular, and then for Christian couples more generally. There's a lot more I could say about the interview, but I think the kind of basic takeaway that I kind of derived from reading it was just kind of this idea that, well, kind of the more old school approach to marriage and sex is, hobbling these guys and these couples' capacity to kind of forge a happy marriage and a good family life in the 21st century. It's kind of my takeaway from this New Yorker interview. But again, in kind of speaking to ordinary couples, generally have the sense that religion helped to forge stronger families, not the opposite. So I'm thinking of a couple who lives in suburban DC, in Maryland, suburbs of DC. They're a Black Christian couple. And so, for instance, like Martin said to me, talking about kind of his approach to the internet, for instance, he said, it's one of those things where, the Bible is very clear about fleeing temptation, he said, adding, so yeah, certain sites I won't go on. And then Martin also stressed that he kind of spoke to his pastor on a regular basis about kind of his marriage and his family life in ways that helped him kind of, forge a path that was, was good for his spouse and for his kids. And then his wife, Kimberly, mentioned that she'd been abused as a child, and so initially for her, physical intimacy was difficult in her marriage. But she says this, let all that. But that's how prayer entered, because I had some stuff happen prior to us that made having sex challenging for me. I'm like, okay, God, you're only going to heal me. Only God can really, truly heal this. Okay, so her prayer, as well as kind of some conversations with women in her church, helped her kind of to navigate this initial phase in her marriage and move beyond the pain and to forge a good marriage, both kind of physically and more generally as well. So again, their story kind of doesn't really, I think, match the message that the New Yorker was conveying about kind of the average links between religion and marriage in America. But what's kind of the bigger empirical story? Well, in our UW survey, what we find is that couples who attend church together are significantly more likely to be happy in their marriages, about 15 percentage points, as this slide indicates. And I want to be clear here, I'm not saying that kind of religion is some kind of like panacea or magic potion makes everything perfect in a marriage. Obviously, that's not true. And you also can kind of take this figure to realize there are about, 18% of religious couples who are not flourishing in their marriage. And they have to be, I think, acknowledged in a discussion like this. But I'm also saying here, obviously, that empirically what we see is that religious couples are more likely to flourish when it comes to marital happiness than couples who've got no connection to a local religious community. I mean, Tyler Vanderbilt at Harvard, for instance, has looked at a large group of women over time and finds that women who are regular churchgoers are almost 50% less likely to get divorced. In his large longitudinal survey tracking women, I looked at a different data set and found that both men and women who were regular churchgoers were about 30% less likely to get divorced. And I wasn't able to kind of look at joint attendance in that data set, and nor was Tyler in his data set. So probably this story for jointly attending couples is even stronger. But again, the New Yorker was kind of suggesting that Christianity basically was a risk factor for divorce. But the evidence points in a very different direction in that score. And then what about sex? Because again, that was kind of a central focus of that New Yorker piece. And one of the more striking, I think, findings in the work that I did with Dr. Wendy Wang for the book is that we found that today, about 2/3 of religious couples who are married in the US have sex at least once a week, okay? And surprisingly though, what we also found is that secular couples, less than 50% of them are having sex once a week. And we see similar trends actually in the GSS recently, but there was actually no gap back in 2000. So there is a growing gap when it comes to sex and marriage in America, but that gap actually runs in favor of religious couples, again, not away from them, as that New Yorker piece might have suggested. And we see too that on average, religious couples are more likely to report that they're satisfied in this domain of life. Again, in ways I think would probably be surprising for folks who just read that New Yorker interview. And that was kind of the basis for their thinking about the link between religion and sex and marriage in America today. So what I'm suggesting to you is that on average, the kind of family-friendly values, virtues, and networks that are found in religious communities typically, again, typically, not always, but typically strengthen and stabilize marriage. And also just kind of on that happiness point that I began our conversation with this afternoon, it's also, I think, important to note that I do see that some of the groups that I talked about in terms of being the masters of marriage, like religious Americans, conservative Americans, college-educated Americans, are happier than their fellow Americans. This kind of just gives you the religion story here. They're more likely than GSS, for instance, if they're very happy if they're religious compared to secular. And what's interesting about this pattern is that we also see that kind of the fact that they're more likely to be married and happily married explains about 1/3 of their advantage on the happiness front. So part of this happiness story that we're seeing for certain groups in America comes back to the marriage and family story we're discussing today. So kind of let me just conclude by saying that I think, from my perspective, our elite institutions have been too dedicated to propagating kind of a Midas mindset that privileges things like money and education, especially work. And we should be kind of thinking about ways to have our elite institutions do more to revive a kind of marriage mindset where love and marriage and family are prioritized more in the kinds of messaging that we're doing to young adults especially. And this will require, of course, to reform existing institutions, higher education, for instance. It requires building new institutions in the media, for instance. We've sort of seen that happen recently. And then expanding the work of existing civic and religious efforts to strengthen marriage and family life as well. And in particular, there are kind of 4 steps I think we should be taking to strengthen marriage and family, to kind of reverse this closing of the American heart that I mentioned earlier. And that would be 1, kind of doing a better job of family life education in our schools, both public and private, and in religious youth groups as well. Doing more in social media to kind of combat false facts and narratives like the ones that I've articulated coming from Bloomberg or the New York Times or the New Yorker. 3rd, to have new efforts to advance family ministries. And here a group called Communio, which is doing a pretty intense effort to strengthen family ministries in both Catholic and Protestant churches across the U.S. And then fourth, to kind of advance civic efforts kind of locally, like the San Antonio Marriage Initiative, which is taking place just about an hour south of here, and is dedicated to providing kind of a variety of sort of PSAs and educational and counseling services to young adults and dating and married couples kind of across the age spectrum, again, just down in San Antonio. So taking steps like these could not be more important because forming men and women to live out a life dedicated to making a gift of self to others in the context of marriage and family and preparing the next generation to do likewise is the best path, I think, to reviving that most important Jeffersonian pursuit, which again is the pursuit of happiness. So, thank you. I'm happy to answer questions you might have about the book or the presentation.
Okay. So I have had an empirical question about the causes of the decline in marriage and number of children per person for a long time that I'm hoping to get your thoughts on. I agree that there are definitely cultural changes, and the cultural changes seem to be a big focus of the discourse, but I wonder if another cause is the rise of birth control and the lower teen pregnancy rate, which then leads to people having fewer forcing functions for getting married. Because there are a lot of people that if somebody gets accidentally pregnant, but then they'll say, okay, we're gonna do this, we're gonna start a family. And I wonder if you've seen any research on that. And then second, how I have a hard time with I agree that the decline of marriage and the the lower placement is bad, but then I also think that fewer teen pregnancies is good.
Sure.
So if that is a cause, what do we do there?
Yeah, great question. So on my first point about contraception, there's work from Janet Yellen, who's our current Treasury Secretary, and George Akerlof that does suggest that some of the shifts we've seen really since the 1970s can be, and 60s can be tied to contraception and abortion kind of becoming part of the technological and relational mix in America. On the issue of teen pregnancy, I would say certainly part of the fertility decline that we've seen in recent decades can be traced to declines in teen pregnancy. And I would also agree with you that that's actually a good thing. And so what I want to see in terms of kind of going from here is that we'd be able to figure out ways to encourage, 20, 30, and early 40 something women and their husbands to both to get married and have kids in greater numbers, but I'm not looking to kind of increase the teen pregnancy rate.
Right. No, I wasn't suggesting that, but
right.
it is a bit like it's consistent with there also being this kind of like educational and class divide, like
Sure.
socioeconomic divide almost.
Right.
Where people who presumably that are more educated have more time and perhaps and just to pursue marriage and family. That it seems like it's a big factor that is largely missing from the discourse of why this is occurring, in my opinion.
So I talked primarily today about kind of the cultural dynamics I think are in play to some extent when it comes to both this decline in marriage and also why some groups are actually kind of bucking some of these larger trends. There's also obviously a class story as well. I think when it comes to the class story, kind of the big part of that story is that we're seeing in working class and poor communities a lot of couples where the guy is not flourishing in the contemporary labor market. We're seeing market declines for men in that part of our society who are not employed full time. And that's one of, I think, the factors helps to account for both declining rates of marriage that are more pronounced working class and poor Americans, and also the fact that they have higher rates of divorce if they do marry than more educated and affluent Americans. So certainly another part of like the bigger story when it comes to understanding this sort of closing of the American heart is that in the contemporary economy, there's a certain set or a certain kind of group of men who have become relatively disadvantaged compared to their grandparents or their grandfathers in our contemporary economy and society. Those teenage boys and young men and now middle-aged men, kind of in that working class and lower income part of our society, have been hit harder in today's sort of information service economy than the kinds of men who get degrees at a place like the University of Texas at Austin. And those men are doing incredibly well in today's economy, and that's, I think, part of the reason why they are still appealing as potential husbands, and they're also way less likely to get divorced. So we see, for instance, is that one of the biggest predictors of divorce is not being employed full time. That's much less common for men who've got a college degree, or even more so a graduate degree, than it is for guys who are less educated in the US.
Maybe there's an economic component to the solutions as well as.
Yes, no, certainly in the book I talk about some of the economic pieces, of this puzzle as well. Yeah. Yes, sir.
So the fact that Asian Americans are doing really well in this dimension is surprising if you look at East Asia. So South Korea, China, Japan, they all have seen, plummeting birth rates and marriage rates.
Right.
So what's going on?
Yeah, it's striking. If you look at trends, even for like South Koreans versus Korean Americans, Korean Americans now are markedly more likely to get married and have more kids than their peers back in South Korea. So I think what's happening, it's a complicated question, it's a good question, but I think part of what's happening here is that in the US context, what we see is, and this also tells us too that some changes are actually good for us, but in the United States context, I think wives get more kind of practical help from their husbands when it comes to both housework, especially kind of the care of the children, than they would in South Korea. We also see in the United States too, on the economic kind of side of things, that housing is relatively more affordable in the United States than it is in South Korea. Housing is a big predictor of family formation. And then I think, even though I would say that there are parts of the economy where people are working, hours that are too long, our culture of work is not as intense as the culture of work in South Korea. So it's not as family friendly as I would like it to be in the United States, but it's comparatively more family friendly in the US than it is in South Korea, for instance. So I think, and also our approach to education is as stressful as it can be here in the US, it's not nearly as stressful as it is in South Korea. And so a lot of people have the sense that they have to invest, especially the moms in South Korea, a lot of time and energy and attention and money in their kids' schooling in ways that kind of make having kids more daunting in South Korea than it would be here in the United States. So those are some reasons why I think that South Korea has some unique challenges in terms of the role of men, the culture of work, the cost of real estate, and their educational system that make family formation even more challenging there than it is here in the States. Yes, ma'am.
I haven't read your book yet. You talked a little bit about culture, class, economics. What's the role of politics, impact, or political, what's going on with American policies that impact the closing of America's heart to marriage?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I argue in the book that in different ways, Republicans and Democrats have not done an adequate job to kind of basically advance policies that I would view as family friendly. And there's more in the book on the whole issue. But to kind of just give you one example of how this is sort of played out in the real world, is that Congress has moved in recent, really in the last 2 decades, to address some of what are called the marriage penalties in the tax and transfer system. So kind of depending on whether you are married, cohabiting, or single, obviously, and your income for each person and how many kids you have, you're going to be treated differently by our taxes and our transfers in the United States. And so there are some ways in which for upper income Americans broadly defined, our approach to taxation can penalize married folks. But there's been a lot of efforts to address those marriage penalties in the tax system since 2000. And so those have kind of benefited folks who are in the upper income distribution of American families, okay? Unfortunately, though, when it comes to lower income families, Congress has not addressed those marriage penalties in programs like Medicaid, for instance. And I talk in the book about interviewing particularly working class couples where both parents have some kind of incomes between about 25 and 55,000 for their joint incomes. In those situations, they have one or two kids, and they're just much more likely to face a kind of marriage penalty with programs like Medicaid, for instance. So I talked to a Virginia couple, for instance, where she was on Medicaid, the two kids were on Medicaid, and they were kind of together in a very conventional way, but they weren't married, because if they were to marry, they would lose access to Medicaid in Virginia. Okay? And so the irony here is that Congress has addressed the penalties in the very portion income distribution that's doing pretty well in the marriage and family front, but has not addressed the transfer-related penalties that make it economically less, either attractive or even really possible for working class couples and kids to marry. So there's certainly a policy kind of dynamic, or a number of dynamics in play that are also part of the reason why we've seen less educated Americans floundering more family-wise in our country than more educated, more affluent Americans. That's why.
So with the legalization
So I'm just going to turn my phone. It's buzzing and beeping, and it's distracting. So sorry about that. There we go. Okay, go ahead.
So with the legalization of same-sex marriage about a decade ago, I think the promise and kind of the discourse was sort of like rising tide floats all boats, more marriage for more people, it's going to be better for all marriages. The data you've shown us, I would suspect, don't bear that out. But I'm curious, do you address same-sex unions in the book at all? How does that factor in? And what do you think has been the overall impact since the river fell on marriage?
Yeah, so I don't actually address same-sex couples in the book, in large part because there weren't enough of them, in large-scale data sets to kind of make meaningful conclusions about. So if you take like a sample of 2,000 married folks in the U.S., you're only getting a small share of folks who are in same-sex marriages. And my colleague, Dr. Wendy Wang, has found that, for instance, when it comes to married families with kids, less than 1% of them are headed up by same-sex couples. So I wasn't able to kind of draw any meaningful conclusions from this particular project for that question. It does suggest to us that, again, that only a small share of married Americans are in same-sex marriages, and that sort of share shrinks even more when talking about married families with kids in the U.S. Yes, sir.
Do you think that the greater disparity between male and female participation in higher education in the workforce? I'm pretty sure actually about that now even more women go to college than men.
Yes.
Do you think that has had a negative effect since like 1970, for example, on marriage and birthing?
Yes, I do think kind of the relatively changing fortunes of men and women and young women, is part of the reason that we're seeing less marriage in America today. And one reason that I was motivated to write the book was that when I've been talking to UVA students, especially female students, they're often kind of expressing concern about their ability to find a young man who is either A, kind of interested in committing to them, or in a sense worthy of commitment. And I think the fact that most universities have relatively more women than men makes dating that much more complicated. And then also as they kind of move into their 20-something years, there are just fewer guys out there who are kind of roughly at their either educational or their economic position. And because women still like to marry guys who are roughly equal to them in status or even higher than them in status, this shift in education is problematic. But it's important to note that it's still the case that kind of men's income seems to be a better predictor of marriage than men's education. And there are obviously guys who are working in public safety or working in the trades, for instance, who are not college educated, who are earning good salaries, have good jobs, and those men are doing pretty well in the marriage market. But I do think kind of just the broader dynamic of men often kind of floundering in today's educational system and economy, and women doing relatively better, especially compared to where they were, say, 50 years ago, is creating new challenges for young adults in terms of finding someone who kind of fits their expectations of what a spouse should look like economically and professionally. Yes, sir.
Spiritual realities.
So in my book, I focus on church attendance, or religious attendance, as the primary measure of kind of marital quality and marital stability. So that's what I look at in this book, Get Married. And again, I do find that couples who attend church together are happier in their marriages. Other folks find it less likely to get divorced. And then I also find that they're more sexually satisfied. So that's certainly kind of a relevant part of the story. In other work that I've done, I found that couples who pray together, outside of just saying grace at meals, are markedly happier in their marriages. And I do find that kind of regular prayer for couples together is a pretty powerful predictor of, again, marital quality. So that's sort of one other obvious way of sort of measuring this sociologically. Yes, ma'am.
Your research highlighting four groups that are succeeding in marriage. You look at the average age at which these individuals marry, and does that have any effect?
Yeah, it's a good question. I didn't look at the age of marriage for this book, but I can tell you that college-educated Americans, marry relatively later. Conservatives and religious Americans marry relatively earlier. Asian Americans, I think, marry a little bit later, but I have to kind of go check on the data for that. But sort of the broader point I'm going to make here is that when it comes to age of marriage, there are kind of maybe three different stories to sort of mention here. One is that on average, young adults who are marrying in their late 20s and early 30s have the most stable marriages. But young adults who are marrying in their mid-20s, kind of broadly defined, have the happiest marriages. So there's some of different outcomes. And we could talk about that, maybe afterwards, in terms of what's the difference in terms of how it plays out in marriage. But then also religious couples who are marrying in their 20s, broadly defined, but attend church together, for instance, don't experience that elevated divorce risk that more secular Americans who are marrying earlier would experience. So age of marriage and religiosity are some of the factors that kind of are linked, in the data to both marital quality and marital stability. Yes, sir. Yeah.
I'm having trouble understanding the phrasing or the framing of closing the American heart. Like on the previous slide we had earlier with the Pew research, it had marriage and wanting to have kids as lower concern. But very, very high in concern level is still having closeness of friendships, having relationships in general, not feeling alone, having part community. And people feel lonely because they feel a sense of missing. So why phrasing closing the American heart doesn't feel like people are closing themselves off to connection?
So the way that I was just thinking about this kind of phrasing was I think about heart in terms of both kind of romantic love and then marriage and then sort of starting a family. On those three dimensions, we've seen the share of Americans who are dating is falling, the share of Americans who are getting married is falling, and the share of Americans who are having kids is falling. So kind of that was sort of how I was thinking about kind of the heart is closing off in some ways for a minority of Americans to these expressions of love, if you will. Even on the friendship point, though, we're also seeing some evidence from Dan Cox at the American Enterprise Institute that that friendship for younger adults seems to be, especially younger men, I think, in his work, if memory serves me, is coming down. And I would say that because of the rise of what I call electronic opiates, social media, gaming, and other forms of digital entertainment, I think that's also kind of one of the factors that is inhibiting kind of in-person friendship and dating and marriage and family life too as well. Yes, sir.
I love Dan Cox. Thank you for the talk, Mr. Wilcox. With his friendship survey, we're seeing friendship groups shrink across the board for men and women in America since the 90s. And I talked to a couple of times with Professor Stanford about what is the best predictor for discovering your future spouse. And so it's three things. One, most likely to be a friend of a friend. Two, they have to have a lot of friends of friends themselves. Kind of shows that they've like established a value to the community, sort of central. And the last part is that they need to connect two previously disconnected groups of your friends. So your friends are like Ben and Ashley, they all know each other. Your future spouse to be the friend of a friend connecting both of them. Curious if you see anything in your research similar to this, and if you have any sort of elaboration on the discovery of spouses, especially with like online dating, and any proposed possibly unpopular solutions that you've heard people suggest.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, it makes sense to me, the network story that you're telling me. The only thing that really kind of immediately jumps to mind is that my colleague, Dr. Wendy Wang, has found in her research that, and just looking at kind of where people met, that folks who met in a religious community, folks who met in a college community, folks who met at work, and then socializing with friends. So, 4 different kind of social contexts that roughly kind of, I would say, map onto what you were just articulating, are more likely to be happily married. And that by contrast, folks who met online, and the folks also met in a bar, were not as likely to be happily married. And I think part of what could be happening in those patterns is a kind of network story that kind of comports with what you're saying, but also I would just suggest too that you might get kind of better information, on a variety of different levels, obviously even implicitly, in these more in-person social contexts, than you would be getting from the dating app or from some kind of in a bar. You don't have any kind of real broader social context to sort of understand the person you're meeting as well. So, but in terms of the takeaway here, I would sort of say, and I do know people too who have met online or happily married, but I think we need to try to figure out ways to increase opportunities for young adults, to meet and mingle in, in-person contexts, and encourage folks not to, if they, especially in their 20s, to gravitate towards, dating apps, which I think are conveying less information and kind of doing less to sort of situate them in a real social world, but also encouraging adults to be more deliberate about dating than they have been, I think, oftentimes in recent years. Taking the risk to date, which is needed. Recognizing you're going to fail, often. But if you don't fail, pretty good thing.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yes.
So you talked about what you call electric opiates, but I feel like a lot of what you talked about with that, giving examples of, they're undoubtedly like the future of just humanity in general. Do you think marriage rates will bounce back as humans become more adapted to more like internet environment?
Yeah, so I think obviously there's a kind of declensionist narrative in my book, but I do think, as we look kind of at the broader sort of social history, any kind of major technological change can be hard for a society to navigate initially, and then they can make adjustments oftentimes that make it, less difficult to navigate. And I can certainly see a time in the future when we're able to kind of harness technology in more kind of marriage and family friendly ways. And one example, even on the dating apps, issue is I have there's a former UVA student who's created a dating app that's called Keeper. And it's sort of like the exact opposite of Tinder in terms of how it works. It uses AI to kind of match people who are interested in marriage or in like a serious relationship, rather than kind of the more casual approach that Tinder seems to favor. So the idea here is that some technological innovations could kind of like help steer us in a more, for instance, marriage-friendly direction. But I do think too, the subcultures, in contemporary contexts that are more successful in sustaining in-person community are going to be more successful also in fostering marriage and happy families. Because you just can't get around the way in which, and there's something, and I'm not a medical scientist, obviously, or a biological scientist, obviously, but there's something profound about the in-person, connections that we make that is, I think, more powerful when it comes to friendship and intimacy than what you do, through some kind of electronic medium, right? So I'm just saying, I think this, again, the subcultures that are able to kind of limit the power of these new technologies will be more successful in cultivating friendships, marriages, and families as well. But yeah, there are going to be, some modifications that make technology less, anti-nuptial. Yeah, last question.
We talked about Asian Americans earlier, and I keep coming back to the fact that you mentioned that you mentioned community, and we tie those to sort of religious practices. And so I was wondering, I don't know if the statistics are for Asian Americans, religious statistics are, whether that's more or less. And it also made me think about different religions and how those could act as different treatments, and whether there's data on that.
So on the Asian kind of question, it's important just to sort of, I think, acknowledge that there are kind of traditions that are oriented in a more kind of collectivist and familist direction in many East Asian and South Asian contexts. And we see in the United States, for instance, that no group of Americans have more stable marriages than immigrants from India. And there's just a kind of a really strong familistic culture that has kind of grown up in India over many centuries, that still kind of shapes the context of marriage kind of like for immigrants from India and second, third generation Indian Americans as well, for instance. So I think there's some distinctive cultural factors that are uniquely relevant for Korean Americans, Chinese Americans, Japanese Americans, and Indian Americans, for instance, above and beyond just the religion. And some of them are religious. Some of them are Christian, some of them are Hindu. We can kind of go through the different traditions of Muslim as well. But I think there's something beyond the religious piece that's, kind of arising from different East Asian and South Asian cultures that's more familistic. That's part of the story. On the religion question, I look primarily at sort of expressions of religion that are more generic, like religious attendance, and I think they're often more predictive than religious tradition for family outcomes. But I have done work that's a bit older, for instance, that would suggest that like evangelicalism is linked more to marital happiness, than being Catholic. I'm Catholic, but being Catholic is linked to more marital stability, than being evangelical Protestant. So I think there are some kind of nuances that kind of map onto, religious tradition in ways that we could explain. But I would kind of point the finger more often just to whether or not someone is religious, be they, for instance, evangelical Protestant or Catholic, rather than which tradition they're coming from. So. All right. Thanks, Brad.